So that was some triad pairs ideas, just using two major triads to come up with 6 different notes. So I introduced the idea of triad pairs a couple of weeks ago, and the idea is that you take 2 triads that don't have any notes in common. So you've got 6 different notes and you turn them into an exercise and you use them to create lines. So this week I'm going to try and explore all the ways that you can use 2 major triads. I'm just going to use major triads this week. And try and use them to make exercises, to make lines, and then I'm going to show you how you can use them to improvise. So last week we looked at taking 2 major triads a tone apart from each other. So for example C and D, and we came up with lines like so that kind of thing. Now there's actually only 3 different ways that you can arrange 2 triads, 2 major triads, and get 6 completely different notes. Now the first one is the one I showed you last week with the two triads a tone apart. Now the next way to do it is with a semitone apart. So if you take, rather than taking a C triad and a D triad, take a C triad and a D flat triad. Now you get this. So it creates a nice kind of like Phrygian dominant kind of sound. Almost like if you take two major triads that are a semitone apart, gives you that cool kind of Spanish flamenco-y sound. So that's the sound that you get when you take two major triads that are a semitone apart. So the third way of arranging 2 major triads to get 6 different notes is to take 2 triads that are a tritone apart, so an interval of a flattened fifth. So if your first one is C, then your second one would be G flat. So you can arrange those triads, you could do something like this. Now that one's a really cool one. That's a really useful one to use, especially for jazz improvisation. So just say, for example, you were going to use those 2 triads and play them over a C7 chord. So it gives you a kind of alto dominant sound. So what you get when you combine those 2 triads is you get 6 notes that make kind of a scale, something like this. So that's C major triad, G flat major triad. Okay, now what you get with those 6 notes is you get the basic notes of a C7 chord, so C, E, G, B flat. But you also get these other 2 notes. You get the G flat, which is a sharp 11, so it gives it kind of a Lydian dominant sound. And then you also get a flat 9, the D flat, so it gives it kind of an alto dominant sound. So you get these 2 triads give you one very inside sounding triad, the C triad, and one very kind of outside sounding triad, the F sharp triad. So those are the only 3 ways that you can arrange 2 major triads to give you 6 different notes. Starting on C each time, you can do C and then D, C and then D flat, C and then G flat. So that's a tone, a semitone, and a tritone. So how can you use those ideas to come up with lines? How can you use those to improvise? Well, I'm going to borrow some chords from Chick Corea's Spain, which is a really popular jazz tune to improvise on. And I'm going to show you some ideas that you can use over that progression. So we're just taking the solo progression, which starts on a G major chord. Now, G major chord, you could think of that as being the key of G major and use C and D major triads, because those are chords 4 and 5 in the key of G major, but I'm actually going to think of that G major chord as being Lydian. So Lydian means the G itself would be chord 4 and chord 5 would be A. So I'm going to use the 2 major triads, G major and A major, to come up with lines over that G major chord. So here's the G major chord, and here's the 2 triads. So that's the sound over that G major 7 chord. Now the next chord, it drops down, the root note drops a semitone, and we have an F sharp 7 chord. Now this is a great opportunity for us to use that Phrygian dominant sound that I spoke about earlier with the two major triads that are a semitone apart. So we can use F sharp major and G major triads. So Okay, so let's listen to that again. So on the G major chord, we have G major triad and A major triad. And on the F sharp 7 chord, we have F sharp major triad and G major triad. It's going to sound something like this. Here's the G major chord. F sharp chord, F sharp 7. Okay. So you can improvise lines just using those triads. Now, the next thing that progression does is it goes into a 2-5-1-4 progression, which is just a really common jazz chord progression in the key of D major this time. So we've got E minor 7, A7, D major 7, G major 7. Now, obviously all of those chords are in the key of D major. So you could just say, oh, well, that's D major. We can just use G and A again, because that would be chords 4 and 5 in the key of D major. So you could just use G major triad, A major triad, and play that over all 4 of those chords, and it would sound something like this. So that works, but it's arguably not the most interesting way to play over that progression. So a slightly more advanced way to think about that would be, so you can think of each chord separately. So if we think about the E minor 7 chord, and we will treat that as being chord 2 in the key of D major. So we're going to use exactly those 2 triads that I just demonstrated, the G major and the A major triad. So over the E minor 7 chord, they're going to sound like this. So the next chord is the A7 chord. Now we can think of that as being an altered dominant chord. So we can use the 2 major triads that are a tritone apart, the flat and fifth interval, and it would give us A major and E flat major. And we can come up with lines over that A7 chord using those 2 triads. So we could do something like this. So that's A major triad going up, E flat major coming down, E flat major going up, A major going down. Okay, so next on to the D major 7 chord. So again, we could treat that as being chord 1 D major, or we could treat it as Lydian again. So we could treat it as being chord 4. So instead of using the G and the A major triads, we would use D and E. So making a Lydian sound. So we get something like this. And then finally on the G chord, we'd be back to our G and A major triads. So again, treating that G as a Lydian sound, which is what it should be, really. So if we just go through all of that from the beginning again. So on the G major chord, we're going to play G and A major triads. And then on the F sharp 7 chord, we're going to use F sharp and G major triads. And then on the E minor 7 chord, we're going to play G and A again. And then on the A7 chord, we're going to play A and E flat major. And then on the D major 7, we're going to play D and E. And then on the G major chord, which is kind of back to where we started again, we're going to play the G and the A again. Okay, so those are the kind of ideas you can use. And there's one more idea which I'd just like to show to you that you can use on that A7 chord. So in that same progression, we've got that 2-5-1-4 progression in D. On that A7 chord, if we're going to think of that A7 chord as an altered dominant chord, we can think about using the altered scale, which would be something like this. Okay, so that's altered scale starting on A, which is the same as like a B flat melodic minor scale. Now there's actually 2 major triads that are a tone apart in that scale. So in that altered scale, you find 2 major triads on the E flat and on the F. So instead of using the A and the E flat triads like we did before on the A7 chord, we can use E flat major and F major triads. So it's going to sound something like this. And what comes after the A7 chord is the D major 7 chord. Now remember, on the D major 7 chord we were using D and E major triads. So what we're going to do is we're going to play E flat and F major on the A7 and then D and E on the D7. And all that is just dropping down a semitone. So those lines that you were playing on the A7 chord with E flat major and F major, you can then just drop down a semitone to the next chord, which is your D major chord. And then on the G major chord, you're using your G and your A major chords again. So this is just a few ideas about how you can use these triad pairs to play on jazz chord progressions. Now, once you get into these triad pairs ideas, you'll realize there's so many options. It just goes on and on and on. So I think I'm going to put out a part 3 video, because so far all I've looked at is just arranging 2 major triads. But obviously we haven't looked at arranging minor triads, we haven't looked at arranging diminished or augmented triads, and obviously you can combine different types of triads. The idea is just that you find 2 different triads, whatever type of triad, that give you 6 different notes, and you know, it kind of leads to different scales as well. So it's kind of tied into the idea of hexatonic scales with 6 notes in, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to find 2 triads that give you 6 different notes, and then when you've got those 6 different notes you can arrange them into a 6-note scale, a hexatonic scale. So there's loads more we can cover with this, but for this week just practice those major triad ideas. So you can arrange 2 major triads a tone apart, a semitone apart, or a tritone apart.